Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Glasgow Loves EU live stream. I'm Martin Roche. With me tonight is Jenny Wilson, who's handling the social media and questions. So please, let's have your questions as we go through this next half hour. This evening, our guest is the journalist, broadcaster, author and playwright Tim Walker. Tim has a distinguished career on Fleet Street, and he's covered a huge range of big stories, particularly in politics and the arts. Many of you will know Tim from his Mandrake Diary in the New European newspaper. He's also the paper's theatre critic and regularly writes about famous stars of stage and screen that he has known, some of them, I think, very well. Tim himself is now a successful playwright. His play, Bloody Difficult Woman, opens on the 2nd of August in Edinburgh at the festival. And it had its London debut earlier this year. And it played to full houses during its run. So welcome, Tim, on behalf of Glasgow Loves EU. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your time this evening, particularly given that the play is opening very shortly and is now in rehearsal in Edinburgh, and you've got a lot to do. So just before we got into talking about the play and the arts in general, let me ask you about recent political events. You worked with Boris Johnson for 12 years at the Daily Telegraph in Fleet Street. So can you give us your reflection on his fall from grace and where you think this leaves the Conservative Party?
I think what's sad about it is that it was inevitable, his fall from grace. I mean, anybody who knew him, anybody who had ever worked with him, anybody who had come anywhere near him knew that this was the last man in the world who should ever have been prime minister. He was so dishonest. You'd have to look out of the window if he said it was a sunny day. This was a man. A lazy man, a dishonest man, a venal man, an untrustworthy man. And if you'd said to me, and I must have worked with thousands of people in my newspaper career and the media generally and met so many people, if you'd said to me, if there was just one Tim who should never have been prime minister, I'm afraid I would have said Boris Johnson. So what has happened has not surprised anybody who knew him. That's the simple truth. The tragedy is, of course, we now look at what's happening in terms of the leadership election. Truss came from nowhere. We will remember that at the beginning, it looked very likely that it would be Rishi Sunak. He seemed, way ahead of the field and the obvious favourite. One man and one man only on this side of the border decided who it was who would actually succeed Johnson. And it was Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail. He decided, and he made it very clear, quite early on, that he would be backing Liz Truss. And Liz Truss, it is now almost certainly going to be our next prime minister. So not only is this a leadership contest to decide our next prime minister that you and I and nobody on this call, so far as I know, has any say in whatsoever, it's also been decided by one man telling that very small group of pink-trousered men and blue-ribbed ladies, to stereotype them, but most of them are like that, to be perfectly honest, who to vote for. So I think it's a very bleak situation. I mean, Truss at the moment is debating whether or not to allow Andrew Neil to interrogate her in the way that, to be fair to him, and to his credit to him, Rishi Sunak is going to do. I think we all think that Liz Truss is not the most intelligent woman in the entire world, but I think we think that she is so unintelligent that she can only really trade up. If I was doing her PR, I'd say, Liz, get on TV. They think that you are so thick. You just have to show more intelligence and, certain forms of pond life, and you'll be streets ahead and you'll be winning. But having said all of that, it's a bleak and depressing situation. And probably we will be stuck with Truss, who will almost certainly win for several years, and heaven knows what further damage she can do to our country and its reputation abroad. When I say our country, I mean all of our countries, because sadly you're lumped into this as well up in Scotland.
I'm sure we are. We've been through now 6 years of 8 years nearly of turmoil following Brexit. And out of that came your play, A Bloody Difficult Woman. Can you just give us a little snapshot of what the play is about? Because it's so much of it is about what you've just been talking about. So if you could just say a word or two.
I mean, I knew Gina Miller reasonably well for about 10 years before her case. People have sometimes asked me if she's my heroine, And I think in life, you should never have heroines or heroes because they always disappoint. And, Gina's a very much a mortal being at the end of the day. And she makes mistakes. She does things of which, one doesn't approve necessarily. But having said that, there was a day I went to see her in the Supreme Court, and it was a very dark, cold night. And I left the court that evening with her and some other people. And I saw these great big brutish guys, young guys, tattoos, the works, shrieking at her, we're going to, lynch you. We're going to do all these terrible things to you in front of your children. They were shrieking at her, as far away as I am from this camera. And I must say, as a chap, my lower lip was going a bit. I thought, this is terrifying. The police can't keep control of this. And I kind of, in the darkness and the rain, looked at Gina, and she was very serene. And I thought to myself, whatever one might think of this woman, whether you're pro-Brexit or against Brexit, I thought that was courageous. I then got into the characters of it all. And it was an odd situation. I knew all the characters. I knew Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail. I'd worked for him for 10 years up until the millennium, long before Brexit.
And this was when Gina was backed the legal action against the proroguing of Parliament.
That's correct. Well, yeah. And so I knew all of the characters involved. I knew, Dacre was a very domineering character. And clearly, when Gina began her case against Theresa May's government, it clearly inflamed him. And to some extent, it was the end of my love affair with newspapers, because that headline that he used, what was it again? It was almost from a play, wasn't it? That famous headline that they used. Enemies of the people. Sorry, how wonderful. I'd actually forgotten this headline has dominated our lives. It was the absolute nadir, really, of the whole Brexit debate. It was basically saying mob rule, and Ibsen's play Enemy of the People is actually about the dangers of mob rule. So it was almost as if Paul Dacre was trolling us at that occasion. And there was a kind of mob mentality. Theresa May, who I also vaguely knew, she visited the Telegraph once. I had observed her quite close up. Awkward, shy lady. Again, she was the least appropriate person to be prime minister. It was almost cruel to put that poor woman up in front of people when she was so shy. So you've got these characters, these two women, both determined, both stubborn. May, I think, probably thought, okay, she could bend the rules a little bit and get this thing through. And, she was rather upset, I think, that Gina Miller wanted to make a big issue of it. But Gina's case, and, Lord Panic, who represented her in the case, and by the way, he gives his own voice to the play, they thought, well, fine, if we give way this time on parliamentary sovereignty, if we let a prime minister do whatever a prime minister wants, then the precedent is a very dangerous one. And that was really what it was all about. But I look back on that time, really, it was an odd, McCarthyite, strange, horrible time when, the Daily Mail actually wrote that Gina Miller should be, like Joan of Arc, she should be executed, and that would be almost too good for her. And I couldn't believe that, I went into journalism. I didn't necessarily want to do good all the time. I wanted to entertain people, perhaps, but fundamentally, I did not want to do bad. And I couldn't understand that colleagues were writing this about a woman I knew. So I found the whole thing very depressing. But the play, having said all that, which begins at during the Edinburgh Festival at the Assembly Rooms, the Brackett's Ballroom, on August the 3rd, and it's on for the whole of the festival. I realized with the play, I had to use all my skills really as a journalist. There had to be an element of lightness of touch. You can't just lecture people. And it has to really get into the humanity of all the characters involved. And what startled me was people who came to see the play, they were laughing at it. They found it very entertaining. They understood that, you got under the fingernails of all the characters. And I suppose in a strange way, maybe I wanted it to be my love letter to Gina Miller, but it ended up being lost in the post, and it ended up being a kind of love letter in a way to Paul Dacre, because Andrew Woodall, the guy who was playing it, it was Bill Kenwright, he said to me, you have created a great stage monster there. The Guardian critic, incidentally, said, oh, the joke about the swearing wore a bit thin. I worked for Dacre for 12 years. He swore throughout that period. He couldn't finally end the play, talking like Mother Teresa of Calcutta. So there was a very odd thing said about that play. But having said all, and a lot of papers, of course, couldn't or wouldn't review it because it was, obviously the Daily Mail couldn't review it. I know the critic there. I know he would have liked to have reviewed it. So it created, I don't know, it was a mischievous thing. And people like Geordie Gregg, the former editor of the Daily Mail, the man who succeeded Paul Dacre, he was there on the first night laughing like a howler monkey. It was almost a kind of seditious act to go and see this play. And all I'd say, if anyone does see it up in Edinburgh, I promise you, it'll be fun. You will enjoy it. But ultimately, it's a tragedy, because that's what our politics is at the moment.
It is a tragedy, and it picks up, Tim, on what Paul Dacre is guilty of, and what a number of other newspapers, and to some extent some broadcasters have been guilty of, which is client journalism. That newspapers, the media, to a huge extent, has given up any pretense to objectivity and has simply become the voice of the government, of the Conservative government of the day. How dangerous is this in the world of newspapers?
I think it's terrifying, really. I mean, our lives are being controlled by a few non-dom elderly men, the Barclay brothers. We're now down to one of them, Rupert Murdoch. Paul Dacre is a very interesting case in point. I mean, love him or hate him, I'd say up until around, the early 2000s, he was a very well-respected man. His newspaper was commercially a big success. The circulation was doing very well. And, as I say, I didn't necessarily agree with all of his politics, but I respected him as the preeminent newspaper man of his day. However, where he, I think, lost touch really with what his career was all about was when he started going after the Ofcom job, which clearly Boris Johnson wanted him to do at the broadcasting regulator. And that was where he became very different from the kind of newspaper men. And they were men, actually, in this case. Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, who, of course, broke Watergate. And I'd say Harry Evans at the Sunday Times, the thalidomide investigation, and so on. But those two guys, they died as newspaper men. They were great editors. And they would have been horrified if they'd been closely connected with the government in the way that Paul Dacre is. We hear, and it was a bit like all those jokes about poor Donald Sinden when we were younger, which was always on a program called Spitting Image. People were always joking that Donald Sinden wanted a knighthood. It's now become a kind of national joke that Paul Dacre wants a peerage. If he gets this peerage, where is the honour? Where is the dignity in an honour that everybody knows how he got it? The paper's behaviour over this has been very odd, really.
I mean, one of the other consequences of the massive upheaval of Brexit and politics, of course, was the arrival of things like the New European and Byline Times. Is there something of a realignment going on, or is this just a chattering classes making themselves happy and talking to each other?
Well, I'd love to be able to say there's a massive flight to quality in journalism. And although it is true that the Financial Times is doing very well commercially now and selling a lot of copies, The Guardian, I've noticed too, is saying that it's now in profit for about the first time, in many, many years. That the New European should start from zero and get up to, a point where it is commercially viable. And publications like Byline Times too, that they're doing, they're managing to make headway in this very competitive, commercially ruthless market is a good thing. But I think it would be overdoing it to say that we're all going to be so much more educated in the future. The reality is an awful lot of people still read The Sun, an awful lot of people still read the Daily Mail and the Express and the Telegraph and so forth. So there's a lot of nonsense going out there all the time. And what's sad, really, is that there's a generation that people like Rupert Murdoch, the Barclay brothers and Lord Rothermere and Dacre, have a kind of brainwashed, that there's certain people that you find it very difficult to have a conversation with now. And I think that is what's so very sad. And I think politically that damages our politics because a lot of people are laboring under all sorts of misapprehensions.
And that, it would seem to me, makes the arts and culture so much more important, that the weakening of the infrastructure around the arts and culture and this huge British political situation, which is not just Brexit, it's it's the way that Johnson managed the country, it's Scotland's position, the position Northern Ireland, etc. But it seems that the arts really haven't responded to this particularly strongly. We don't hear a lot of rock music about these situations. We don't see too many. There's a few books about it. I think there's your play. I don't know. I'm not aware of any other plays. Is it? Why do you think that the world of arts and culture has been so ineffective here?
I went to see a play at the National a few weeks ago, all about the assassination of Gandhi, and suddenly, randomly, one of the characters suddenly made a reference to Brexit, and we all thought, where does that come from? And nobody in the audience was terribly impressed. I think the National generally thought, we'd all think, gosh, how incredibly brave to put a completely uncontemporaneous reference to Brexit in a play all about Gandhi. And I thought, if this is the best the National can do about a kind of upheaval in our politics of a kind that I've never seen before, then I thought that is a bit pathetic. We had to, of course, James Graham's Channel 4 drama, Brexit and Uncivil War. And of course, he ended up getting in a huge row at the time with Carol Cadwallader, who said, look, you're whitewashing mendacity, you're whitewashing liars. She was incandescent with rage about it. James Graham said, well, I had to put both sides of the argument. I mean, where does it end? Where do we have to stop putting both sides of the argument? This is what's gone wrong with the BBC and their journalism, putting both sides of the argument. I compare and contrast with, say, Arthur Miller in America at the height of McCarthyism in the 1950s, when it damaged his career, it damaged his income stream. He happily put on the Crucible, which was a damning indictment of McCarthyism. I think we have been gutless in the theatre world. I think dramatists have been gutless. I mean, James Graham also wrote a play called Ink, all about Rupert Murdoch. It was such a devastating attack on Rupert Murdoch that Rebecca Brooks, one of his senior executives, blocked book tickets for colleagues to go and see this play. And I noticed afterwards, James Graham started writing an awful lot of freelance pieces for the Sunday Times, a Rupert Murdoch title. I think playwrights, I think dramatists, and, maybe I think too much like a journalist as a dramatist, but I think we are there to cause, well, not necessarily cause trouble, but at least be honest. And I think that's what people saw in Bloody Difficult Women. And it thrilled me that younger people, the audiences were incredibly young night after night. The theatre said they'd never seen such young audiences, but the young people loved it. They understood that for once somebody wasn't patronizing them. They were prepared to have a sensible conversation about Brexit. What I find so sad on this side of the border, down here in London, we can't anymore really have a very sensible conversation about Brexit in our newspapers. We certainly can't do it on our TV shows. It reminds me very much of that line in A Few Good Men, when I think it was Jack Nicholson shrieked at Tom Cruise, "You can't handle the truth." And I think it's the case that most people in England at the moment cannot handle the truth about Brexit. They can't even, they don't even want to discuss it. It's become a great unmentionable, and I think that's tragic.
So I'm just going to check with Jenny. Do we have some questions there, Jenny?
Yes, we've got a few questions. I think on what you were just saying there, one, is there any element of that maybe people just didn't actually understand Brexit and all the different aspects? And somebody is Jenny Breslin is asking, do you think there will ever be an inquiry into Brexit and the lies around the referendum?
I think there should be, and I think it's interesting. I don't know where these two contributors have come from. I suspect they may not necessarily be in England. All I know is an awful lot of people from Scotland, from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, from abroad, ask me, the journalists come over and from abroad, and they'll say, like, why can't you have a conversation about this? This is, we can see what your prime minister is doing. We can see the billions of pounds that have gone off to cronies or, on test and trace. And of course, Brexit itself, the biggest of the lies, the 350 million a week for the NHS, which it's now, we're all having to accept, it's just about crumbling now. It's in its death throes. Why is this man? Why is it in politics that you can lie? Why is it that in any other field of endeavor, if I did that in journalism or any other serious job, why is that allowed? I honestly don't know the question. There should be an inquiry. But I think a lot of it, I fear, comes down to the leader of our opposition in Keir Starmer, who is kind of now going along with all of this nonsense. He should be up on his feet every day. You know, he's a prosecutor at the end of the day. He's a lawyer. He should be prosecuting Johnson in the Commons because, you know, before he gets him in the courts, hopefully. But certainly, I mean, America's been better about this with Trump. You know, they're beginning serious legal proceedings against him, which are sort of at least beginning. And yet we're talking about Johnson coming back. I think something's gone very badly wrong in our politics. I think we've become deferential and frightened, and I think he's an old Etonian, and I think we doff our caps to him. I mean, you know, the class system is alive and well.
It's interesting, a report this morning that even the Murdoch press in the States seems to be walking away a bit from Trump. Which would be a very, very good thing. Tim, I want to come on in a minute to a subject that's of particular interest to Scotland and its economy and the arts. But first of all, I want to ask you, of course, the phrase bloody difficult woman comes from Ken Clarke, ostensibly saying it to a mic he didn't think was on. He said of Theresa May, she's a bloody difficult woman. Did either Ken Clarke or Theresa May come and see the play?
A Tory MP called Giles Watling came up to me and he said, look, I'm close to Mrs. May, and, you know, I'll tell her, you know, this play, you know, it gets across her, you know, her dignity. It gets across, you know, that she's a human being. It's not uncritical of her, but, you know, it doesn't demonize her. And I thought there'd never be any interest in doing that dramatically anyway. She didn't. I mean, I got in touch with her office before we announced the play was going to take place, and I talked to a very nice lady at the other end of the line who said, what's the play called? I said, Bloody Difficult Women, a slight intake of breath. But to be fair to Mrs. May, she had no issue with it. She you know, she didn't want to stop it. Same with Gina Miller. Again, I think it was very painful for her, certain aspects of the play, because I get into, you know, both of May's private life and Gina's private life, by which I don't mean their sex lives, but I mean tragedies in their lives that they've had to deal with that have been painful for them. And I know Gina found it very painful. But I do think it's typical that it's the man who is in the play who has the problem with it. It's Paul Dacre who sends endless legal letters to the producers of the play and to the theatre. And it shows, I think, that men are much vainer in a way, and I think much more thin-skinned. But it is ridiculous when a newspaper man who at that very time was lecturing everybody about the Meghan Markle copyright case that his newspaper was involved in at the time, saying it was all about freedom of expression and that you know, Meghan Markle should allow his newspaper to say things, while at the same time being very thin-skinned about himself. So I think there was a disconnect there. And in terms of my relationship with newspapers, I mean, I also got a call from the Washington Post, the newspaper that made me want to go into journalism. You know, we all saw our generation films like All the President's Men about the Watergate scandal and how that newspaper very nobly exposed it. And they phoned me up about a story called Carrygate, which we'd broken in the New European, all about how the Times had dropped after its first edition a story saying that Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, had tried to get him a job, get Carrie, his then mistress, a job at the Foreign Office on 100K. And I found it heartbreaking that she's phoning me up asking me about this new gate, you know, a rather sad and sordid gate compared to the gates that the Washington Post broke. And it made me aware, really, how big the distance is between the ideal of when I went into journalism was and the reality now, which is a bit sordid. I mean, newspapers don't have to be that as bad as they are at the moment. We're still a free country. And I don't understand why people like Lord Rothermere, who gave this big speech to celebrate the Daily Mail's 125th anniversary. He said, we are the paper that exposes charlatans. And I might add, they then accidentally copied out the Times first edition story all about Johnson trying to get Carrie the job at the Foreign Office and then dropped it. So not only were they completely spineless, they were also incompetent because they didn't realize that their own editor had already rejected the story. So, you know, this is just a catalogue of rather sort of sordid and sad and frightened instances of journalists really not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not representing their readers anymore. They're representing their non-dom owners and very rich people. Yeah,
that's well, of course, the Conservative Party has become like that because it's only got arguably up to 200,000 members who can't possibly fund it. So the funding has to come from somewhere else, and that's a narrow group of very rich people and very powerful people.
A lot of them Russian, by the way, and that's why we've got into a bit of a pickle.
Yeah. Tim, when we spoke and setting this up, you talked about, and this is an issue I think of very great importance to Scotland, about the Edinburgh Festival, and you're feeling that a lot of the stuff at the festival for drama groups and poetry groups and dance groups and almost any companies involved with the Fringe has just become almost prohibitively expensive. It can't be that prohibitive because there's clearly a large number of performances, but nonetheless, there's a feeling, and I've seen this on the Twitter sphere myself, that a lot of groups are finding the sums of money that are being caught. So, I mean, the festival's 75 years old this year. It's been just, one of the great Scottish achievements in Scottish tourism, Scottish cultural life. Is this in danger of turning it into a sort of golf type of approach?
The problem, the essential problem that we have, and so many theatre groups has, is accommodation. I don't say Scottish landlords isn't the phrase to use here, but landlords who operate in Edinburgh, who may or may not be Scottish, and they've possibly domiciled abroad for tax purposes, but they have put up the rates to get property, to rent a place, to any kind of accommodation at all, is now usuriously expensive. I mean, we are a relatively small little theatre group, there are 6 actors, there are a few creatives. It's suddenly costing us £20,000 so far to accommodate all the creatives up there. Clearly, you have to behave properly with the actors. You can't just say, look, it's up to you to find your own place. You have to accommodate them. It's your problem. Now, clearly, if you've got 20k coming out, immediately, A, that's not going to the creatives. B, that's, making it much harder to break even, to make it commercially viable. I know of theatre groups, extremely good theatre groups, very talented actors, performers, who have just said, look, we can't do it this year. It's too much. We can't afford to accommodate ourselves and our people up there. And I think that is impoverishing the Edinburgh Festival, which, has an amazing reputation. We all revere it and love it. But the danger is it'll become like a kind of Glyndebourne for very rich people. It'll all become a bit posh and a bit snobby, and you won't get the talent. I mean, would we have done it? Would we have taken our play up there if we'd known what the costs were going to be? I wonder. It's a financial nightmare for all of the performers up there. And would we want to come again next year if we had another play? Honestly, I don't know. I mean, Brian Cox the great actor, has already been talking about this. And unfortunately, the way our society works is the people who actually create things in the artistic world are not terribly well rewarded. So it's a very depressing situation. But I think those landlords, they need to think, if they're going to starve, the talent, coming to that festival, then they're not going to keep getting their rental income. So they need to be realistic, because I can see this all sort of spiraling out of control within maybe just 2 or 3 years. We'll be talking about a massively diminished Edinburgh Festival quite imminently, because what I'm hearing from other people who are much more experienced about the Edinburgh Festival than I am, this is my first time, they're saying, look, we can't take it. We're not going to come back again. And I know a lot of people have already withdrawn.
Tim, we've got, can you hear me? I think I'm having a slight technical problem. You can hear me all right?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay. We've got one more question. I just want to check with Jenny if there's any other questions that's come through before I come back to that.
I think I was just going to ask, we'd heard about the sort of person who ran the Edinburgh Festival or the Edinburgh Fringe saying Brexit had affected things. They were struggling to bring people in from abroad. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, I think there are realistically, practical problems that we have. I mean, I was hoping to fly up there. British Airways has said that 2 of the flights that I had booked have been cancelled. Then it's the onus is on you to then try and find another flight. At this late stage, it's very difficult to get a train up there. It's also very expensive. It's not much more expensive, frankly, to fly up than it is to go by train. Of course, we know too that how expensive it is to fill up the tank with petrol. So you can imagine the journey from London. You're virtually taking out a second mortgage. So physically getting there is harder this year than ever. I mean, thank God, the Edinburgh Festival crowd are genuinely very enthusiastic, and they'll walk through flames to get up there. But I'm just saying we're really not making it easy for people. But then again, having said that, we just have to look at Dover, we have to look at our airports, we have to look at our trains. Transport in this country is becoming an absolute nightmare.
Tim, we're about to wrap up in a minute or two. And just before we do that, I want to talk about Labour's position. We know that Starmer has almost shunned every aspect of Europe, no prospect of rejoin as far as he's concerned, not even a mention of the single market or the customs union. It's all about the red wall, clearly, but it's clearly also on the other side of the coin is there are a very, very large number of Labour voting Remain people. How do you think we can best influence the Labour Party and Starmer, at least to keep a glimmer of hope alive for a more sensible relationship with Europe?
Well, there's never been an opportunity for a shadow chancellor to propose a way of literally transforming the economy overnight. The shadow chancellor would only have to say this to, for the stock market to rise, for the economy to pick up, for business confidence to start to rise in this country. All this shadow chancellor would have to say would be, whoever he is or she is at the time, we are going to re-enter the single market. If they could even go further than that, it would be better. But that was all they need to say. And I don't understand why Starmer, who I remember speaking as a passionate, pro-European in the old days, I don't quite understand what's happened to him, really. And we should have on our political scene a mainstream politician, one lonely mainstream politician who's prepared to walk around wondering if Brexit has been such a good idea. We know, talking to ordinary people, however they voted in that referendum, they're not happy with the way things are working out. Businesses are starting to collapse. The kind of old age that we will all have, you and I, and the kind of youth that younger people will have growing up, it's going to be impoverished. It's not going to be much fun. I don't know why we're doing it to ourselves. We all make mistakes in our own lives. Why, as a nation, can we not make a mistake, admit we made the mistake, and kind of correct it as best we can? Because this is costing us far more than any of us could have been imagined at the start, because it has been cack-handedly dealt with by this government, and we've made enemies all over the place. I think it's an absolute tragedy, really, what we're seeing.
I imagine, Tim, that there's not a soul on this tonight who wouldn't agree with that. So thank you very much indeed. It's been a comprehensive tour de force, full of passion and interest and fascinating insights, and we're extremely grateful for your time. Thank you to everybody who's watched it, and please look out for further events like this from Glasgow Loves Europe and all the other Love Europe groups across the UK. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.